There is a clear American majority out there that is the voting bloc that would carry the day, historically accurate, not religiously driven, and does not have a political agenda. There is a clear American majority out there that is the voting bloc that would carry the day if we just got together and called it something. This is Steve Gibson reporting. A shout out to Tiger Logic for their production value. I recommend them to everyone. Back to the American voting majority. What am I talking about here? What I'm talking about are the characteristics of what is a very clear voting majority. It constitutes what is effectively the American electorate in not the fringes. The fringes, frankly, are those folks that vote in the primaries and select the candidates from the Republican and Democratic parties who more often than not do not represent the American majority. In theory, we need a new third party, and that third party would constitute an American majority. What would that party look like? Well, first of all, if you read my novel, Logics Dictate, you will discover a little bit more about what this party does in fact look like. There's a lot more going on in Logics Dictate than just politics. There's a lot of action and romance and things of that nature, but there is a deep dive into politics and philosophy. And in part, that deep dive goes into what this rational, logical American electorate really looks like. Well, it is fiscally conservative, which means it doesn't want high taxes. It does not want the government to spend a lot more money than it should. It wants money discipline when it comes to the American government, whether that be the federal government, state, or local governments. There's no question that Americans are willing to spend tax dollars on certain things like education and police and military defense and certain other government programs and perhaps healthcare. But Americans, for the most part, do not want high taxation, and they want the government agencies to be efficient, not wasteful, and at some level conservative. This is a fundamental winner when it comes to American elections. The American electorate also is, for the most part, socially liberal. What that means is they do not want government interference in their lives. Americans are, for the most part, in favor of non-discrimination. And that includes non-discrimination against homosexuals, let alone sex, race, or religious belief. By that token, they do not, however, want government to support men being in women's sports. They are commonsensical in a recognition that infusing government activity into supporting men in women's sports would not be appropriate. By the same token, they do not want religion in the schools. They also don't want the schools teaching homosexuality as something that should be an aspiration. While they do not want to have discrimination against homosexuality, they also don't want advocacy of homosexuality in the schools. They also don't want for the most part, wokeness in the schools. Americans want the educational institutions to teach the basic educational disciplines such as reading, writing, arithmetic, science, and at some level social studies that is historically accurate, not religiously driven, and does not have a political agenda. Basically, the facts of what happened. Now, there's a lot to explore there with respect to whether or not our foundational aspects, such as what happened in the colonial times, the aspirations of Christopher Columbus and other founding members of what occurred with respect to how Europe came to the shores of North America, those certainly could be explored in greater detail without it necessarily being an agenda. Whether or not we were justified in how we treated the American Indians and the lessons that needed to be learned at that level, whether or not the foundational aspect in 1776 should have been more aggressive to eliminate slavery. Those are all historically factual discussions that certainly Americans are behind without necessarily it being a woke agenda, without suggesting, for example, that Washington and Jefferson were entirely bad because they had slaves. A balanced approach without it being colored by a particular political point of view is what Americans want. This is an American electorate that voted in Ronald Reagan. It is the American electorate that voted in Bill Clinton. Those voting blocks were remarkably similar historically, and candidly, Clinton and Reagan were not that far apart as far as policies went. Clinton, if you'll remember, was one of the only presidents in recent memory that actually balanced the federal budget. Clinton stood up and said the era of big government is over. This was a centrist president, and at some level, Reagan, remarkably to observe, was somewhat centrist. He certainly spent money to get us out of a recession. He did, in fact, spend money on defense, but his thoughts on immigration and potential amnesty were today something that would be adopted by the Democratic Party. So what has happened is that we have veered too far to the right and too far to the left with respect to certain aspects of our policy. But let's get back to then Trump. What is Trump? Is Trump a right-winger? Is he a centrist? How do we characterize the Trump presidency in light of the American electorate? He clearly won a majority of the vote. He clearly won an outstanding electorate level of the vote as well. Well, we can identify a few things about President Trump. One thing that we can observe about President Trump is that he is not a religious zealot. It appears to me that he's given lip service to certain of the religious right aspects, and he has given, at some level, lip service to the abortion debate. Where he's come down on the abortion debate is effectively let the states figure it out, which is not exactly instituting a national ban against abortion. It's somewhat of a centrist perspective when it comes to that issue. Where Trump does come down, however, is reduce taxation, an attempt to fend off government waste, although he is certainly spending a lot of money on defense. So he's pretty close to being, in terms of a fiscal conservative, where the majority American electorate is. His America First policies is pretty close to where the majority American electorate is as well. This is a fairly novel approach that he's taken, but it's about time that someone has taken it. That having been said, there's no question that the majority of the American electorate is on board with the United States not being taken advantage of anymore and avoiding foreign entanglements where at all possible. This is where there's a little bit of tension with respect to the Iran conflict, but we have to note that this is arguably a very limited conflict and limited engagement with respect to the American military. So far, there are no troops on the ground. So far, it's effectively been aerial and naval bombardment, which comes at relatively little risk to entangling the United States in a long, drawn-out conflict. It's very clear that the Trump administration is avoiding as much as possible a long, drawn-out campaign in the Middle East. And he's been very strategic in his approach towards handling the Iran conflict. We're going to pivot this way. We're going to pivot that way. We're going to engage in settlement negotiations with this unreasonable regime in Iran. This, I think it will be demonstrated, particularly if it's proven that we were able to remove a nuclear threat, that we are ultimately going to open up the Strait of Hormuz. It will be proven that this is a military and policy victory on the part of the Trump administration that ultimately the American electorate is going to be able to get behind. So where does Trump diverge from what is the American majority? Well, one place that he diverges is some of his use of language. And his approach to inelegance when it comes to dealing with adversaries. Arguably, Marco Rubio is going to be much more appealing in terms of his approach, even if his policies don't necessarily diverge that much from President Trump. Another area that the American electorate does want us to do better is how ICE is administering the removal process. That's a difficult task because there's always going to be some level of negligence or other aspect of a troubled administration of an immigration enforcement regime or any police enforcement as well. There's always going to be some mistakes made, there's going to be some bad apples, but the American electorate wants us to be much more balanced on how we are approaching immigration. I would make the argument that either a Democratic or Republican candidate could probably close the border and suggest that we institute some type of amnesty program for the undocumented immigrants that are currently in the country, hardworking, paying taxes, and that's probably going to be okay with the American majority that exists right now. What's not going to be okay to the American electorate is socialism. And wokeness. If the Democratic Party continues to adopt and promote candidates like Mondani and AOC and Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and Newsom and Pritzker, these candidates ultimately will not be electable. The only way they're going to be electable is if they lie to the American electorate and they basically say that they're going to have Clintonian centrist policies as what they administer, and then when they get into the office, they're going to veer left hard. What's likely going to happen is that Democratic candidates in the primaries are going to veer so far left in order to get elected to the Democratic candidacy, and then they're going to be unelectable ultimately in the general election. The only way that they are electable is somehow if inflation runs out of control through the Strait of Hormuz issues continuation for a 6-month period. But that's not likely going to happen under any circumstances. So it's fairly clear that a Marco Rubio type candidate is going to more likely than not win in 2028, and you're going to see an American electorate majority instituted similar to what we had with Reagan and similar what we had to Clinton in what I would say would be a Marco Rubio type presidency. Why do I not say J.D. Vance? Well, I don't say J.D. Vance because I think he's a little bit too hard religious right. And the religious right is not a section of the Republican Party that is going to be associated with the American majority. That's not what the American electorate wants. We do not want a puritanical demagogue that is going to attempt to administer that type of belief structure in policy positions. That's not what the American electorate wants. Please read Logic's Dictate. It is going to detail more about what the American majority is, what a bloc party could be. Please also remember to like, subscribe, and follow so that I can continue to provide this kind of content.